So Eva, you're also very well known for your advocacy on Indigenous rights. There is a degree of bipartisan around the push for constitutional recognition, but the public debate on genuine self-determination and economic development has essentially stalled. What do you think has happened, and how do we best restart this debate?
I think you've got a problem with the question there, quite frankly, because it's making a lot of assumptions. The first assumption it's making is about the closing the gap stuff, which has stalled, but it never really started. There's never been a decent plan which really devolves the decision-making to the level it needs to be made at, that takes on the cultural stuff. And it's got worse. We've got run some very bad Indigenous policies, including the intervention in the Northern Territory, which was continued under Labor, and what's been continuing now, which basically ignores what happens at community level, ignores cultural values, tries to impose Western values, go to school, get a job, economic advancement similar to the women's issues. There's more to life than economic advancement, and that's deeply embedded in Indigenous collectivist cultures. So I think we need to move back and have a look at what's happening within the Indigenous communities, and they're much better at talking about it than I am, but as an outside observer, what I'm seeing is people who are basically saying, stuff the government, they've really stuffed everything. The whole idea of the referendum and constitutional recognition is a white view. It's not something which is very strong with Indigenous communities. They're prepared to wear it and talk about it, but it's not something that most of them have been enthused about, even though the government has made lots of noises about it and some people have picked it up. Because what's the recognition? We don't even know what they mean by that. And most Indigenous people I know are sick of things which are symbolic but don't actually have any practical outcomes. And it's pretty obvious by now that if there is anything in the constitutional change which actually empowers Indigenous people, it's not likely to get through. In fact, it's not likely even to be put up. So there's an increasing rebellion within the Indigenous communities about even going down the constitutional reform area. So I think that needs to be recognised. The other thing is that there's an increasing pressure that is part of that to look at the idea of a treaty. And a treaty is very different from constitutional recognition. In one case, 97% of the population is going to make decisions about how we treat 3% of the population. And that's one of the concerns about what's happening with the referendum. Because if they don't get what they want, they'll be lumbered with what we think they ought to have. The other side of that argument, the treaty argument, is that a treaty is actually a dialogue between equals, or it ought to be. And so there's a lot more pressure now to create treaties as a series within Indigenous communities, and a recognition, for instance, with the Victorian government that this is actually important. So I think that those well-meaning progressives who are working in this area have to seriously start listening to what Indigenous people want and not make assumptions that the bulk of them actually want a referendum. And certainly not unless there's terms in it that are going to improve the status, and that most of what's happening in Indigenous affairs is not what most Indigenous people want, but also to recognise Indigenous people are as diverse politically as any other group in the community. So we just need to recognise that there will be conservatives and radicals within that community and not expect them all to agree, because that's a form of racism as well.